Thank you very much. I think it's great to conclude this part with warnings about measurement error and the issue of intercultural equivalence. Now, indeed, as Ken mentioned, we are a little bit behind schedule. Nevertheless, we can have first reactions right now here, and then we could continue some of the discussion in a smaller group setting. So let me see just first whether there is any reaction from the speakers to each other's presentations. Whether anybody wants to defend his or her position against some of the claims made by fellow presenters. Yes, Michael.
I don't really want to defend, but I want to thank Andreas for reminding us about the limitations of any of these measurement projects. I think he's completely right that if we aggregate everything to the country year, there are limits on what we can understand about what's really going on. I teach a course for undergraduates on varieties of democracy, and I tell them these numbers are just to start. If you really want to understand, you have to do case studies. And one of the things that you learn in a case study is the proper nouns. Our indicators, even the definitions of our indicators, refer to kind of generic actors like parties or the executive or the high court. And in each case, there are specific actors with proper names that do that. And we don't really know what our country experts are thinking of when they're assigning these scores to things. And so I think that it's an essential part of really understanding what's going on to be able to associate the numbers with the specific actors in a case and the specific events that are happening within the course of a year.
Thank you. Yes, Hauke?
Yeah, I just wanted to assure that we do have a Turkmenistan report, Ken. We just do not have an expert that is sitting in Turkmenistan. That is the point. We have a Berlin-based and a London-based expert. And for some countries, we just do not have the possibility to have them there because they are identifiable and they are sometimes under pressure or they get under pressure. We had an Egypt expert that was calling me at night and saying, I cannot no longer work for the BTI because they know who I am and I'm identified and my family is threatened. So that's all. But you will find a very fine 40-page Turkmenistan report. That is, thank you very much, Andreas Schedler, very much addressing the point of what kind of political actors do we have? And what is their spectrum of being possible, being able to reform? Is there any intention of reforming? This is, of course, not only applying to Turkmenistan, but to all the countries. I could not agree more that we should then get to the point, either data-driven or text-driven. I don't really care. I would always advocate to have a text with the numbers, but this is personal preference. But we should get from data and text analysis to the point where we are looking at the behavior and the actions of those that are politically responsible and what is shaping their actions. And again, I believe this is easier when you're having a text analysis to go with that, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Thank you. Well, if I may have a quick reaction, looking at the data presented here today, I was reminded of the fact that we have sometimes the situation of partial democracy, when there is democracy for some, but not for everybody. And I remember that BDEM's data for US on one dimension were very low until the civil rights movement and reform because of lack of equality. And I also noticed that in case of the democracy barometer, countries like Estonia were put very much to the bottom of the quality of democracy. Again, I assume that that was because of the way non-citizens, typically Russians, have been treated. But interestingly, in both cases, democracy developed pretty fast later on, and today we consider Estonia and the other Baltic countries the most democratic corners of Eastern Europe, and of course United States also was a frontrunner for quite some time. So is it possible that equality is normatively a very important dimension, but when it comes to the potential of a country to consolidate democracy, maybe it is not the most crucial one? And in a way that takes me to the question, should we consider, let's say, countries like US during slavery a democracy, or this kind of situation when there is a very clear discrimination, but for the rest of the society there is rule of law and so on intact? I was just wondering whether anybody has a quick reaction on this. Wolfgang, I see you, but was it on this? Or go ahead anyway. You are muted.
Very briefly on your question, Zsolt, should we call the United States of America before they abolished slavery and democracy? It depends very much on the point where you are looking at these democracy, point in time. We would not accept today not only the US with slavery, but even the US before the Civil Rights Act of 1965. We would not consider it as a fully developed democracy because in 6 single states, Black people were not allowed to vote. If we look to Switzerland, we would not, in the year 2000 or 2020, we would not consider Switzerland and working democracy in 1970 because 50% or 50.2% of the people were not allowed to vote. What I want to say is that the content of the terms is changing over time. What we consider in 2020 a democracy will not have been a democracy, let's say, in the United States 150 or only 60 years ago. So if we are across times permanently using the same term, democracy, for the regimes in 1950 and 2020, we do not understand the changing notion of the term democracy. But we are using it. We are using it over time, and even there are clear differences in our understanding what democracy means today than what it meant, for example, in 1960.
Thank you.
But I have a question, if I might, into the round. If we compare the 1990s, where we had this euphoria about the end of history and development to ever more democratic regimes. And now for more than a decade, we have not an optimistic point of view or general atmosphere in politics, but more a gloomy one, seeing all the problems, talking about crisis. And the observation of the indicators, once on Freedom House, but it seems to me on VDEM as well, is the following one, that it is our judgment and the experts' judgment is heavily influenced by this general mood, this general political mood. the more it is looking gloomy into the future, the more skeptical and negative our judgments will be. And the same was true for the other way around. The more optimistic we judge countries or freedom houses like Russia on the way to a liberal democracy in the second half of the 1990s. It was complete nonsense. But at that time, we simply had an optimistic view, and now we have a pessimistic view on the development of democracy.
Michael.
So just a general observation. I think it's important to have consistent standards if we're trying to measure things. Especially over time, it's clear that definitions or understandings of democracy have evolved over the past 100 years or more. But if we want measurements that enable us to make comparisons between past and present, we have to use the same standard for the past and present. It wouldn't do to have a yardstick or a ruler that changes in length to measure different things. We have to, I mean, you could do that, but the measurements would not be comparable over different periods of time. And I think the same thing applies to different regions of the world. I think it's possible to recognize that words mean different things in different places, but if we want to make comparisons, we have to define what we mean by concepts and measure things according to that standard. And that's what makes comparisons possible.
Thank you, Ken.
So, Michael, I think that's a really important point, and I agreed with that point until probably about 4 or 5 years ago when it came to democracy. And here's the simple reason. I think sometimes there are things that arise that affect democracy in mostly depressing ways that didn't exist in previous eras. And it's a challenge for us as to how we incorporate those into whether we can build them into concepts like what is digital misinformation and the subversion of the mixture between what we would consider to be truth and fact, and the manipulation on a mass scale using electronic means, not always through malicious state actors, but through the spread of disinformation and what people, people are being manipulated or just having their minds warped through possibly private groups using social media, or let's say that if we all enter the metaverse in 10 years and there's the distinction between reality and virtual reality is scary to think of, but if that is erased and we have these powerful private actors that can have this incredible influence over what we perceive to be reality, I'm not sure we can fit that into classic measures yet.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think that doing that, I mean, we have data through the Digital Society Project now for that specific point, but it requires some good theoretical thinking to figure out how to incorporate that information into measures.